Thank you very much indeed. And I want to thank Uta and Christian and all of the other people who helped organize this meeting, which gives me the opportunity to visit again with people who I have admired for a long time and who have become friends, valued friends. And I appreciate also the opportunity to do some sightseeing in the city where I was born. What I want to do today is to give a historical and social context to the HIV/AIDS story. It is often said that we live in a scientific age, and it is true that nowadays science is regarded as the chief authority on matters of knowledge. It's believed generally that the scientific method gives objective facts. That's illustrated by the way we speak, in English at least. You could say, tests have shown something. But when you want to make sure that people think it's really true, you say, scientific tests have shown. It's the final imprimatur. And I wonder, as a sideline actually, whether this same thing works in other languages. I know in German, Naturwissenschaft doesn't carry the same rhetorical impact. At any rate, those are the popular beliefs. The actuality is that the scientific method is really a myth. Or perhaps it is an ideal that people try to follow, but it is certainly not the actual practice of the way in which scientists do their work. The main point is that scientific tests, or any sort of tests, have to be interpreted by human beings. And philosophers have long said, facts are theory-laden, by which it's meant that the meaning, the significance of a fact has to be contributed by human beings. And yesterday morning we saw a nice illustration of that already, a photograph of camels in a desert. The objective fact was a two-dimensional representation with lots of yellow and some black and white objects there. That's the objective fact. The interpretation has to be provided by human beings that this represents camels in a desert, and there are at least three possible interpretations. Some people say, well, the black things were the camels. Others say the white things were the camels. And others say, well, maybe, but it could be something else again. In other words, the significance, the meaning of facts is contributed by human beings in science as much as anywhere else, and interpretations are biased partly by individual experiences and beliefs, and partly by the contemporary Zeitgeist or Weltanschauung. Now, the history of scientific progress is that any progress involves some change in our earlier views, and sometimes it involves complete rejection of earlier views, in which case it's common to talk about scientific revolutions. But popularly, it is also misconceived what a scientific revolution is. I think the popular belief is that scientific revolutions bring big advances in a steady sort of way. The actuality is that every such major advance has been resisted fiercely by the those who hold the contemporary view, and we can certainly say that scientific revolutions are milestones of progress, but it is also the fact that they are gravestones of the previous theories. And it has to be that way because anybody who does research tries to build on what is already known, which means in practice you take the contemporary belief for granted. To take something for granted is the same as taking it on faith, taking it as dogma, and so it is natural that questioning any generally accepted belief is likely to be treated as heresy. As we also heard yesterday, there has always been some resistance to fundamental change, and the article by Bauer that was mentioned is a classic one. He gives dozens of names of people we now regard as wonderful contributors to science, but who at the time found it very difficult to convince their contemporaries. And you have names like Ampere and Arrhenius of ionic dissociation, Einstein, Faraday of electrochemistry, Heaviside, the ionosphere, and so on. And Max Planck, who we revere for having the first notions that led to quantum theory, in his memoirs later wrote of his own experience of having his quantum ideas fiercely resisted. And he said, new ideas don't win by convincing those who oppose them. The new ideas, if they're reasonably right, they win out by outliving their opponents. And a paraphrase of that, which I like very much, is that science progresses funeral by funeral. Peer review has to be conservative because the only way in which people can judge is on the basis of what they already know or what they believe they know already. So any marked advance is going to be resisted fiercely, and that is a phenomenon that doesn't enter into the popular beliefs about science, but it is recognized by the people who encounter this, like Peter Duisberg, who had the same sort of idealistic views about science as anybody else, and was utterly shocked to find that suddenly one of his perfectly scientific arguments, well documented as usual, brought him the sort of disgusting attacks and reactions that they did. Something which Bernard Barber said in that article, and which is rather chastening to recognize, is that the same people who find their own ideas fiercely resisted will, on other matters, themselves resist new ideas. And I would guess that most of the people here have grave doubts about whether HIV causes AIDS, at the same time as many of you probably have no doubt that the universe began 10 to 15 billion years ago in a Big Bang, or that release of carbon dioxide is what is causing hot days in Vienna, for example. And yet on both of those issues, there are perfectly competent people who question those things. Well, a different aspect of resistance is something that Gunther Stent called prematurity. He said some ideas are really so far ahead of contemporary thinking that people simply cannot properly grasp their significance. And his classic examples are Gregor Mendel's quantitative laws of heredity. It was completely unprecedented that anybody would try to be quantitative like that about matters of biology or plant breeding, and his ideas were ignored for about 40 years. Alfred Wegener, who not the first, but he insisted that because the shapes of the continents are the way they are, obviously they were at some time joined together. But that idea was not only ignored, but sort of dismissed, even laughed at, because obviously there existed no sources of forces powerful enough to move the continents apart. And again, it took about 40 years before that became a mainstream belief. So premature hypotheses, like Mendel's and Wegener's, are actually very valuable because they stimulate thought. And there have been a number of attempts to bring into public view interesting hypotheses. Jack Good, who was an eminent statistician who brought Bayesian statistics back into favor, edited a collection called The Scientist Speculates, an anthology of partly baked ideas. And the intention of the book was described as to raise more questions than it answers. And Einstein is often cited for a similar sort of sentiment, that the important thing is to ask the right questions. David Horobin in 1975 started to publish a journal specifically for interesting hypotheses in medicine. Springer published for 20 years or so something on a forum for speculations in science and technology. Medical Hypotheses was taken over by Elsevier after David Horobin died, and the fact that Elsevier has killed Medical Hypotheses and that Springer stopped publishing speculations in science and technology, I think the lesson is commercial publishers should not be controlling scientific communications. How to avoid it, I don't know, however. Well, let's turn to some of the consequences of the fact that peer review is conservative. Let me say again, there is no alternative really to peer review because it has a certain valuable benefit. Conservative peer review guards against the publication of things that have silly errors in them. So routine, banal science that offers nothing particularly new is made a bit better by conservative peer review. But it is an entirely different matter when the conservative peer review becomes so powerful that it actually controls research funding, publications, and official public policies. That then leads to suppression and stagnation, even in societies that pride themselves on being free, open, and democratic. The result can be just as damaging as in the Soviet Union, when Lysenkoism really crippled Soviet agriculture and biology for decades. Soviet chemists were not allowed to use the same theory of chemical bonding as every other chemist in the world, or as in Nazi Germany, where textbooks of Deutsche Physik were written in order to leave out anything that could be attributed to someone of Jewish ancestry. Well, the consequences of conservative peer review are, if a mainstream consensus is wrong on a major issue, the consequences of suppressing other ideas can be very damaging. So then, there we go. The question may be, well, could a mainstream consensus be wrong? Well, the point is that in the long run, a mainstream consensus always changes. Otherwise, we would be continuing to believe the same things time and time again. As somebody pointed out yesterday, put it yesterday, we know today that some of yesterday's information was wrong. It takes very little extrapolation to realize that tomorrow's information will look back on today's information and say, you were wrong about certain things. And some of the examples of things that medical science has been wrong about quite recently, the fact that many ulcers are caused by bacteria was resisted for 20 or 30 years, and the doctors who had proposed that were unable to have their colleagues even look through their microscopes. Kuru, mad cow disease, were thought to be caused by slow viruses, and we know that that is certainly not the case. PSA tests were routinely administered for decades on the mistaken assumption that they were a good diagnosis for prostate cancer. And individuals were deliberately infected with malaria. They were given shock treatments with insulin or by electricity, and bits of their brains were cut out, all as supposed treatments for schizophrenia. Those were mainstream approaches. So a mainstream consensus can be wrong. Could that be the case with HIV and AIDS? Well, I think there's little doubt that if someone is told they are HIV positive, that's an intensely stressful matter. And it brings psychological damage and social damage. We know that marriages and partnerships have been broken because one of the partners was found HIV positive. We know that people who have no symptoms at all, who are perfectly healthy, are given toxic drugs on the basis of lab tests of HIV positive and a certain low level, supposedly low level of CD4 cells. We know that HIV positive people have been jailed simply for having sex with other people. Sometimes they've been charged even for biting someone or for spitting at someone. And we know that billions of dollars, actually tens of billions of dollars, have been spent on social programs as well as research. Now, if HIV is a deadly virus for which everyone is at risk, then maybe one could say all those things, of course, are regrettable, but they're just collateral damage. But if the theory is wrong, then these things represent tragedies that are terrible and, one might say, even inexcusable. Well, could the theory be wrong? The way to... there's a time lag here. Could it be wrong? The way to decide, to judge for yourself whether a theory is right or wrong, is to look at the evidence for and against. So let's look at the evidence for HIV/AIDS theory, or try to look at the evidence for HIV/AIDS theory. And what you find is that the mainstream says, well, everyone agrees that it is. They will tell you thousands of researchers and hundreds of thousands of research articles can't be wrong. So if you object, they will say you are in denial, you are practicing pseudoscience, but they don't bother to define how you detect what is denial or pseudoscience. When troubling phenomena occur, like thousands of AIDS patients who are HIV negative, then you can say, well, it's a completely different disease. So you invent the new name idiopathic CD4 T-cell lymphopenia, which being translated means idiopathic means we don't know what causes it, and the CD4 T-cell lymphopenia says it's low in CD4 cells, and that is precisely the same as the original definition of GRID or AIDS was. That there are HIV-positive people who are healthy, well, the mainstream has to treat this as a rare and mysterious thing. And why couldn't we have a vaccine? Well, the virus mutates more rapidly than any other known such critter, and remarkably enough, as it mutates like that, it remains virulent. So that's the evidence for. Evidence against. One aspect is that HIV/AIDS theory has... Again, a time lag, thank you. The first thing is that there are matters that HIV/AIDS theory should have answers for, and it doesn't. Where is the isolation of actual infective virions of HIV from AIDS patients or HIV-positive people? Where is the proof that HIV tests detect infection? As we saw yesterday, even the test kit pamphlets say they don't do that. Where is the proof that HIV causes AIDS, other than everybody knows it? Where was it published and when? It's no good telling us there are hundreds of thousands of articles about it. Which are the specific ones? That we've never been given that answer. And HIV is said to destroy the immune system, but how? There have been about a dozen suggestions made of how that happens, and none of them have stood the test of actual investigation. A second set of reasons why HIV/AIDS theory is unsatisfactory is that HIV and AIDS are simply not correlated. I took the best, the biggest and most reliable database from the CDC of HIV tests and of AIDS numbers in the United States. HIV and AIDS numbers have changed differently over time. They are not correlated geographically. the ratio of men to women affected by HIV has not changed over 20 or 30 years. For HIV, it has changed dramatically for AIDS. Similarly, the ratio for African Americans to Caucasian Americans, for HIV, the ratios have remained unchanged. For AIDS, they have changed dramatically. There are the recognized HIV negative AIDS cases. That's a very bad correlation. And there are long-term people, HIV positive, who have remained perfectly healthy. The same database indicates that whatever it is that HIV tests detect is not something that is infectious, because the geographic distribution in the United States has not changed over a couple of decades, and that's not the case with sexually transmitted diseases or with any sort of contagious disease where you have outbreaks in different places at different times. Not only that, in any group that is tested for HIV, the trend of frequency of positive tests against age is the same. The trend with sex is the same, with race is the same, and even with population density is the same. There has been no actually observed sexual transmission, as was mentioned yesterday. The apparent rate of transmission, which is calculated in indirect ways at about 1 per 1,000 acts of unprotected intercourse, is far too low to explain the supposed epidemic of AIDS. And James Chin, who was seen yesterday in the film, WHO epidemiologist, has used that supposed rate of transmission to calculate that in Africa, 20 to 40% of the adults have a dozen or so sexual partners, and they change those about annually. And this is an absurd sort of contention. It's often said that if you have gonorrhea or syphilis, you're more likely to get HIV, as the data that Christian, I think, yesterday showed. There is actually no correlation between the incidence of gonorrhea or syphilis or the other STDs and of HIV. Condoms actually make no difference. That's what the data say, even though we are continually told not to have sex without condoms. Clean needles for drug addicts do not lead to lower rates of HIV incidence, and there are actually no authenticated cases of healthcare workers, doctors or nurses, who have died of AIDS because of some accidental needle stick. Then there are the most remarkable sort of phenomena that HIV/AIDS theory simply cannot cope with. Mothers are supposed to be able to transmit HIV to their babies through breast milk. Several studies in Africa have shown that when HIV-positive mothers breastfeed their babies exclusively, the babies get nothing except breast milk, they are less likely to become HIV positive than if the breast milk is supplemented with formula or if there's only formula. Several studies in Africa, too, have shown that pregnant women become HIV positive at a greater rate than other women do. And so the HIV/AIDS theory has to presume that when women become pregnant, they also become more likely to have promiscuous and unsafe sex with lots of people. Antiretroviral drugs are supposed to kill HIV in vivo in the body, yet when they are used in microbicides, They don't kill the HIV. It's been impossible to make a vaccine, and even all of the 100 or so trials have not turned up good ideas even for what would make an effective vaccine. Rodriguez et al. Published a study showing that viral load doesn't correlate with CD4 counts, even though it's the virus that is supposed to cause reduction of the CD4 cells. Neither of those two so-called surrogate markers correlates with clinical condition or prognosis. There's supposed to be a latent period of about 10 years between infection and the appearance of AIDS. If you look at the data, you find that the age at which it is most common to become HIV positive is the same as the age at which it is most common to be diagnosed with AIDS, and the same age is the one of maximum probability of people dying from AIDS, or as they call it, HIV disease. So all those overlap. There's no sign of a latent period, and on top of that, that age of maximum probability is in the range of 35 to 50 years of age. In other words, people in their prime years of adulthood are the ones who are most likely to die from this peculiar infection. If you look at the mortality rate at different ages, you find that there is no detectable change with age for deaths from HIV disease. From everything else, people who are older than about middle age are much more likely to die. But with HIV/AIDS, the probability that a 30-year-old will die, who has AIDS, so-called, will die in a given year is the same as the probability that an 80-year-old with AIDS is going to die within that year, and that makes no sense at all. So, to sum up, there's no good evidence for HIV/AIDS theory. There's a lot of evidence against HIV/AIDS theory, both indirect as well as direct. And other people have written a lot about the fact that this dogma really persists because of inertia and vested interests. Tens of billions of dollars annually are spent. Many people make their living from that, social workers and activists as well as researchers. And of course, the credibility of policymakers is at stake. Try to envisage what people would say if it were accepted that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. Politicians have been pouring money into this. People like Bill Gates have been doing that. Egg in the face is a very, very mild way of putting how people would be affected. The worst thing about HIV/AIDS theory is the tragic suffering that it has caused. HIV-positive people have been subjected to physical, psychological, and social damage, and particular groups have suffered from this, most particularly gay men, of course, traditionally, Africans and people of African ancestry, because they tend to test HIV positive at a far greater rate than others, and pregnant women are at risk because pregnancy itself can be a cause of an apparently positive, apparent HIV test. So the situation is really indescribable. I think there is no precedent in the history of science or medicine where there has been such a major mistake made on such a major issue that has affected so many people. Thank you.